early 1900s, Cincinnati had a major defect in its rail infrastructure. The city was served by no less than 7 railroads, which utilized 5 separate stations scattered throughout the city. To further confound travelers trying to go through the Queen City, each of the railroads, except for the Baltimore and Ohio, stopped in Cincinnati, which meant that travelers trying to pass through the city would very frequently have to switch trains, which often meant a switch-in station as well. In addition, these stations were all very old by the early 1900s, with very outdated equipment, and 4 of the 5 were located on the floodplain, which meant that in the springtime and sometimes in the fall, they would very frequently be flooded by the Ohio River, making rail transit impossible. It took a number of years to get the railroads to agree to construct a Union Terminal in Cincinnati, and when it was finally started in 1929, it was an ambitious undertaking to say the least. It was designed for a capacity of 216 trains a day and 17,000 passengers. During the construction, it required nearly 94 miles of rail and 5.5 million cubic yards of dirt to help raise the level of the station above the historic floodwaters. This actually would prove very foresighted in 1937 in the Great Flood, in which photographs of the Union Terminal show the building as an island really surrounded by the floodwaters in the Mill Creek Valley. Although the building opened ahead of schedule and under budget in 1933, unfortunately it was really too little too late in many respects, although possibly you could say too much too late. By the 1930s, rail traffic had already declined due to competition from other resources and the overall poor economic condition. However, Cincinnati Union Terminal did serve a very important role during World War II, and it actually received a record of 36,000 visitors in one day. After World War II, though, increased competition from airlines and highways proved too much for the passenger railroads, and passenger service very quickly declined. By the 1970s, only a handful of trains were going out of the station, and when Amtrak took over in 1971, they were down to 2 trains a day, the George Washington and the James Whitcomb Riley. The building was shuttered in 1972 as Amtrak could no longer justify the expense of keeping an enormous building open for only 2 trains a day. The building remained shuttered for a number of years before an attempt to revitalize the building as a shopping center. The exact reason as to why the shopping center failed, there are numerous reports. However, the short answer is that within a couple of years, the shopping center had proved an absolute bust. Fortunately for Cincinnati Union Terminal, which had faced demolition at this point, the Cincinnati Historical Society, as well as the Cincinnati Natural History Museum, decided to combine forces and create a new museum center. The result was the Cincinnati Museum Center at Union Terminal, which contained an Omnimax theater, as well as the Museum of Natural History and Science, and the Cincinnati History Museum, which at the time was known as the Cincinnati Historical Society Museum. In addition, in later years, they added the Duke Energy Children's Museum, which now becomes the museum complex. And in recent years, we've also added the National Underground Freedom Center to the collection of the Cincinnati Museum Group. As for train service, Amtrak returned to Cincinnati Union Terminal in 1991 with the opening of the Cincinnati Museum Center. Currently, the Cardinal arrives at Cincinnati Union Terminal approximately 6 days a week. The Cardinal, of course, travels between Chicago and New York via Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Charleston, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. In theory, it also arrives at about 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. Through its 80 years of history, Cincinnati Union Terminal has suffered a number of dark periods in its history. However, it remains a very significant example of Art Deco architecture with beautiful murals, and remains an important part of Cincinnati's cultural heritage.
If you want to hear a story about a brave engineer, Casey Jones was the rounder's name. On a 6/8 wheeler, boys, he won his fame. The caller called Casey at 4:30, kissed his wife at the station door, mounted to the cabin with his orders in his hand, and he took his farewell trip to that promised land. Casey